This court recognizes that Cristian Fernandez has been failed by every system designed to protect him. But this court also recognizes that David Galarraga lost his life. There must be accountability.
Just keep looking down, okay? It'll be over soon.
Okay.
The heavy wooden doors of Courtroom 4C in the Duval County Courthouse swung open at precisely 9:00 a.m. on March 26, 2012. The room, already packed with reporters, legal observers, and members of the public, fell into an immediate and profound silence. All eyes turned toward the side entrance, where two armed deputies flanked a small, shackled figure. Cristian Fernandez shuffled forward, his movements constrained by the heavy chains that bound his wrists to a chain around his waist, which in turn connected to shackles around his ankles. Each step produced a metallic clink that echoed through the high-ceilinged courtroom. The sound was jarring, a harsh reminder that the person entering was considered dangerous enough to require restraints. But the person wearing those restraints looked anything but dangerous. Cristian was 13 years old, but he appeared younger. His orange Duval County jail jumpsuit hung loosely on his thin, undernourished frame. The sleeves were too long, covering his small hands except for his fingertips. His pants bunched at the ankles above the leg shackles. He stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed less than 90 pounds. His face told its own story. Dark circles shadowed his eyes that remained fixed on the floor, refusing to meet the gaze of anyone in the courtroom. His cheeks were hollow, his skin pale from months spent in detention, away from sunlight. His dark brown hair had been recently cut, probably by another inmate serving as a jail barber, and it stuck up slightly in the back. He looked exhausted, defeated, and terrified. As Cristian took his seat at the defense table between his two public defenders, the weight of what was happening became palpable. This was not a juvenile delinquency hearing. This was not family court. This was an adult criminal proceeding in which a 13-year-old boy faced a charge of first-degree murder. If convicted, Cristian Fernandez would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would become the youngest person in modern American history to receive such a sentence. He would die in prison, never having experienced adolescence, never having attended a high school dance, never having learned to drive, never having fallen in love, never having lived a single day as a free adult. The judge, the Honorable Mallory Cooper, entered and took her seat. She looked down at Cristian with an expression that was difficult to read. Was it sympathy? Resignation? Sadness at the impossible situation before her? "This court is now in session," she announced, her voice firm but not unkind. "We are here for the trial of Cristian Fernandez, charged with first-degree murder in the death of David Galarraga." And with those words, one of the most controversial trials in American legal history began. To understand how Cristian Fernandez ended up in that courtroom, we must begin at the very beginning, at his birth, which was itself the product of unspeakable violence. Cristian was born on January 28, 1999, at Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami, Florida. His mother, Bianca Galarraga, was 14 years old when she gave birth. She was a child herself, a ninth grader who should have been worried about algebra homework and school dances, not labor and delivery. But Bianca's childhood had been stolen from her long before Cristian's birth. She had been sexually abused by her stepfather beginning when she was 11 years old. The abuse was systematic, brutal, and ongoing. Bianca's mother either didn't know or didn't want to know what was happening under her own roof. Social services were never called. Police were never involved. The abuse continued for years. When Bianca became pregnant at age 13, the reality of what had been happening could no longer be hidden. But instead of protection and support, Bianca faced judgment and blame. Her stepfather denied everything. Her mother accused her of lying. And when DNA testing eventually confirmed the truth, it revealed something horrifying. Cristian Fernandez was the product of incestual rape. His biological father was his mother's stepfather. His grandfather was his father. The man who should have protected Bianca had instead violated her in the worst possible way. And Cristian was the living result of that crime. Bianca's stepfather was eventually arrested and convicted. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison for sexual battery on a minor. But the damage had been done. Bianca, now a teenage mother with massive psychological trauma and zero support system, was left to raise Cristian alone. From the moment he entered the world, Cristian was marked by violence. He was not born into a loving family, eager to welcome a new baby. He was born into chaos, trauma, and a cycle of abuse that had already spanned generations. His very existence was a reminder of a crime, and that fact would shadow him for his entire short childhood. Bianca named him Cristian Alexander Fernandez de Toddler. The last name, Fernandez, was her maiden name. She refused to give him his biological father's surname. She brought him home to a small, run-down apartment in one of Miami's poorest neighborhoods. She had no crib, no car seat, no baby supplies. She was 14 years old and completely unprepared for motherhood. Family members would later testify that Bianca struggled from day one. She didn't know how to hold a baby properly. She didn't know how to change diapers or prepare formula. She was overwhelmed, exhausted, and angry at her stepfather, angry at her mother, angry at the world, and perhaps angry at the baby who was a constant reminder of what had been done to her. Cristian cried constantly as an infant. He had colic and would scream for hours. Bianca, sleep-deprived and traumatized, had no patience for it. Neighbors would later report hearing the baby crying at all hours, often with no one attending to him. Multiple calls were made to Florida's child abuse hotline in Cristian's first year of life. But somehow, nothing changed, and the cycle of violence continued. Early childhood abuse. Ages 0–4, 600 words. By the time Cristian was 18 months old, Child Protective Services had been called to investigate the Galarraga home 3 separate times. The complaints ranged from baby left alone for hours to visible bruises on child to unsanitary living condition. Each time, a caseworker would visit, document the issues, and recommend services. And each time, nothing substantial would change. When Cristian was 2 years old, Bianca was arrested for domestic violence. She had been involved in a physical altercation with her then-boyfriend, a 19-year-old man named Jorge, who dealt drugs out of their apartment. The fight had turned violent. Jorge punched Bianca in the face, breaking her nose, and she retaliated by stabbing him in the arm with a kitchen knife. Police were called. Both were arrested. Cristian, who had witnessed the entire incident, was found by police officers sitting in a corner of the apartment, rocking back and forth, covered in blood spatter from his mother's injuries. He was removed from Bianca's custody and placed in emergency foster care. For 6 months, Cristian lived with a foster family in Miami. During this time, his foster parents reported that he was severely delayed developmentally. At age 2, he was not yet speaking in full sentences. He was not potty trained. He had frequent tantrums and showed signs of anxiety and attachment issues. A pediatrician who examined him noted that he was underweight and showed signs of possible neglect, including dental decay and delayed motor skills. The foster parents attended a court hearing and recommended that Cristian not be returned to his mother's care. They offered to adopt him. But Bianca had completed a court-mandated parenting class and anger management course. Her lawyer argued that she had made progress and deserved another chance. The judge agreed. At age 2½, Cristian was returned to his mother's custody. It was a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. Back in Bianca's care, the abuse escalated. She had a new boyfriend, a man named Marcus, who was even more violent than Jorge. Marcus had a criminal record that included assault, battery, and drug possession. He moved into the apartment shortly after Cristian returned. Marcus did not want a toddler around. He saw Cristian as an annoyance, a burden, and a reminder of Bianca's past. When Cristian cried, Marcus would scream at him to shut up. When Cristian made messes all toddlers, Marcus would punish him physically. He would slap Cristian across the face, yank him by the arm hard enough to leave bruises, and lock him in a closet for time outs that would last for hours. The abuse came to a head when Cristian was 4 years old. One evening, Cristian spilled a cup of juice on the living room carpet. Marcus, who was high on methamphetamine at the time, flew into a rage. He grabbed Cristian by the leg, lifted him off the ground, and twisted. The bone snapped with an audible crack. Cristian's screams brought neighbors running. An ambulance was called. At the hospital, doctors immediately recognized that the injury was not accidental. A spiral fracture of the femur in a 4-year-old does not happen from a fall. It happens when someone twists the leg with significant force. Hospital staff called Child Protective Services. Marcus was arrested and charged with child abuse. Bianca was investigated for failure to protect. And Cristian, once again, was removed from his mother's care. But once again, it wouldn't last. After Marcus was convicted and sent to prison, and after Bianca completed another round of court-ordered classes, Cristian was returned to her custody. He was 5 years old, and the nightmare was far from over. System failures and CPS involvement. Ages 5-8, between the ages of 5 and 8, Cristian Fernandez was the subject of no fewer than 6 Child Protective Services investigations. Teachers, neighbors, medical professionals, and even family members reported concerns about his welfare. Each report painted a picture of a child living in dangerous, chaotic conditions. And each time, the system failed to protect him. When Cristian started kindergarten at age 5, his teacher immediately noticed red flags. He came to school in dirty clothes that often smelled of cigarette smoke and body odor. He frequently arrived without having eaten breakfast. He had difficulty focusing and would sometimes fall asleep at his desk. Most concerning, he had visible bruises on his arms and legs. The teacher, Mrs. Sandra Copeland, documented the bruises and reported them to the school counselor, who in turn filed a report with CPS Dykes. A caseworker named James Burton was assigned to investigate. Burton visited the Galarraga home in November 2004. What he found was deeply troubling. The apartment was in disarray, trash overflowing, dishes piled in the sink, clothes strewn across every surface. The refrigerator contained almost no food. Cristian's bedroom was actually a corner of the living room, where a dirty mattress lay on the floor. There were no sheets, no pillow, no blankets. Bianca, when interviewed, was defensive and hostile. She insisted that Cristian's bruises came from playing rough at school. She claimed that the mess in the apartment was temporary, that she had been sick and hadn't had time to clean. She promised to do better. Burton recommended that the family be provided with in-home services, including parenting classes, mental health counseling, and assistance with housing and food. The case was classified as services recommended rather than substantiated abuse. Cristian remained in his mother's care, but the services never materialized in any meaningful way. Bianca attended 2 counseling sessions and then stopped going. A home visitor came once, was turned away at the door, and never returned. The case was eventually closed due to lack of cooperation from the family. The pattern repeated itself over and over. In first grade, Cristian came to school with a black eye. His teacher reported it. CPS investigated. Bianca claimed he had fallen off his bike. The case was closed. In second grade, Cristian missed 43 days of school. When he did attend, he was often disruptive, getting into fights with other students and talking back to teachers. A school counselor referred the family to CPS for educational neglect. An investigation was opened. Bianca promised to make sure Cristian attended school regularly. The case was closed. When Cristian was 7, Bianca began a relationship with a man named Pernell Williams. Williams was 32 years old, had a lengthy criminal record, and was on probation for aggravated assault. He moved into the apartment with Bianca and her children by this point. Bianca had given birth to 2 more children, both from different fathers. Williams brought a new level of violence into the home. He was controlling, paranoid, and sadistic. He enjoyed inflicting pain. And he targeted Cristian in particular, seeing the boy as competition for Bianca's attention. Williams would beat Cristian with belts, extension cords, and his fists. He would force the boy to hold stress positions, arms extended, holding heavy books for an hour or more as punishment for minor infraction. He would lock Cristian in a small bedroom closet, sometimes for an entire day, with no food or water. He would withhold meals as punishment, telling Cristian that he didn't deserve to eat. And Bianca, rather than protecting her son, often participated in the abuse. She would hold Cristian down while Williams beat him. She would laugh when Williams humiliated the boy. She told Cristian, repeatedly, that he was worthless, that he ruined her life, that she wished he had never been born. Cristian tried to tell people what was happening. He told his third-grade teacher, Mr. Ramirez, that his mother's boyfriend was hurting him. Ramirez filed a report with CPS. An investigation was opened. Williams and Bianca both denied the allegations. Cristian was interviewed by a caseworker, but he was too scared to repeat what he had said to his teacher. Without corroboration, the case was closed. By the time Cristian was 8 years old, he had learned a terrible lesson. Telling adults about the abuse was pointless. No one would believe him. No one would help him. He was on his own. And so, he stopped asking for help. Life with Pernell Williams, ages 9-11. The 3 years Cristian spent living with Pernell Williams, from age 9 to age 11, were the darkest period of his childhood. Williams' abuse was not impulsive or reactive. It was calculated, methodical, and designed to break Cristian's spirit. Williams established a rigid set of rules for the household, and Cristian bore the brunt of enforcement. He was required to wake up at 5:30 a.m. every morning to clean the apartment before school. If the cleaning wasn't done to Williams' satisfaction, Cristian would be punished. He was not allowed to speak at the dinner table. He was not allowed to watch television. He was not allowed to play with his younger siblings. Any violation of these rules resulted in brutal punishment. Williams kept a wooden paddle in the kitchen, a thick piece of oak that he had drilled holes into to reduce wind resistance, as he told Cristian. The paddle left welts and bruises that lasted for days. Cristian learned to hide the marks by wearing long sleeves and pants, even in the sweltering Florida heat. But the physical abuse, as terrible as it was not the worst of what Williams inflicted. The psychological torture was even more damaging. Williams would play mind games with Cristian. He would set impossible tasks: clean the entire apartment in 30 minutes, complete a week's worth of homework in an hour, and then punish Cristian when he inevitably failed. He would promise rewards for good behavior, then withhold them at the last moment, laughing at Cristian's disappointment. He would force Cristian to stand in the corner facing the wall for hours at a time, sometimes overnight. If Cristian moved or fell asleep, Williams would wake him with a slap or a kick and restart the clock. Most cruelly, Williams would threaten Cristian's younger sibling. He would tell Cristian that if he misbehaved, didn't cooperate, or told anyone what was happening, Williams would hurt the younger children. "It'll be your fault," Williams would say. "If they get hurt, it's because you couldn't follow the rules." This threat was particularly effective because Cristian loved his younger siblings. Despite everything he had endured, despite the chaos and violence that surrounded him, Cristian had a protective instinct toward the younger children in the house. He would share his food with them when they were hungry. He would comfort them when they cried. He saw himself as their protector, even though he was just a child himself. The abuse took a severe toll on Cristian's mental health and development. By age 10, he had been diagnosed with ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, by a school psychologist. He was prescribed medication, but Bianca rarely remembered to give it to him, and Williams refused to allow it in the house, claiming that psychiatric medication was for weak people. Cristian's academic performance suffered dramatically. He had once been an average student, capable of grade-level work when he attended school regularly. But by 4th grade, he was reading at a first-grade level. His math skills were even worse. Teachers reported that he seemed unable to focus, that he would stare off into space for long periods, and that he sometimes had outbursts of anger that seemed disproportionate to whatever triggered them. These outbursts led to frequent suspension. When Cristian was suspended, he would be sent home, where Williams would beat him for making trouble at school. It was a vicious cycle from which there was no escape. Cristian tried to run away from home multiple times between ages 9 and 11. Once, he made it as far as a gas station 3 miles from the apartment before police found him and brought him back. Another time, he spent the night sleeping in a park before being picked up by officers the next morning. Each time, police would return Cristian to his mother's custody. Each time, they would file a report noting that the child seemed afraid to go home. Each time, CPS would conduct a cursory investigation and close the case. And each time, Williams would punish Cristian for running away, beating him savagely and telling him, "There's nowhere you can go. No one wants you. You're stuck with us." By age 11, Cristian had stopped trying to run. He had stopped trying to tell people what was happening. He had shut down emotionally, developing what psychologists would later describe as learned helplessness, a psychological state in which a person who has been subjected to prolonged, inescapable trauma stops trying to escape, even when escape becomes possible. Cristian believed with absolute certainty that there was no way out, that this was his life, that he was trapped forever. Psychological damage and breaking point. Age 12. By the time Cristian turned 12 in January 2011, he was a profoundly damaged child. Multiple psychological evaluations conducted after his arrest would reveal the extent of the trauma he had suffered and its impact on his developing brain. Dr. Michael Brannon, a forensic psychologist who spent over 50 hours evaluating Cristian, diagnosed him with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, reactive attachment disorder, RAD, major depressive disorder, and borderline intellectual disability, IQ of 79. Cristian's brain has been fundamentally altered by chronic trauma, Dr. Brannon would later testify. When a child grows up in an environment of sustained abuse, their brain develops differently. The amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for fear and emotional responses, becomes overactive. The prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and understanding consequences becomes underdeveloped. Dr. Brannon explained that children, like Cristian, often live in a constant state of hypervigilance. They are always on alert for threats, always anticipating the next attack. This chronic stress floods the brain with cortisol and other stress hormones, which over time can cause actual structural changes in the brain. Additionally, Cristian suffered from what psychologists call complex trauma or developmental trauma disorder. Unlike PTSD, which typically results from a single traumatic event, complex trauma results from prolonged, repeated exposure to traumatic experiences, especially during critical developmental period. Children with complex trauma often struggle with emotional regulation. They have difficulty controlling their anger, managing their fear, and responding appropriately to stress. They may have intense emotional reactions that seem disproportionate to the trigger. They may dissociate, mentally check out during stressful situations. And they may have difficulty forming healthy attachments to caregivers. All of these symptoms were present in Cristian. Teachers described him as a child who could go from calm to explosively angry in seconds. He had difficulty making friends because he didn't trust other children. He had virtually no relationship with his mother or her boyfriend, viewing them primarily as sources of danger rather than sources of support. Perhaps most tragically, Cristian had learned, through years of experience, that expressing vulnerability was danger. Crying brought punishment. Asking for help brought mockery or violence. Showing fear invited further abuse. So Cristian had learned to suppress his emotions, to present a blank, affectless exterior, even when he was terrified or in pain inside. By early 2011, Cristian was reaching a breaking point. At home, the violence and chaos had escalated. Williams had been arrested again, this time for possession of cocaine, and was in and out of jail. When he was home, the abuse intensified. When he was gone, Bianca took out her frustrations on Cristian, blaming him for the instability in her life. At school, Cristian was failing every subject. He had been suspended 4 times already that school year for fighting with other students. He was isolated, with no friends and no adults he trusted. And perhaps most significantly, Cristian had been given responsibilities that no 12-year-old should have. With Williams frequently in jail and Bianca often high or absent, Cristian was expected to take care of his younger sibling. He was expected to feed them, change diapers, keep them quiet, keep them out of trouble. He was a child being forced to parent other children, and he had no idea how to do it. On March 3, 2011, that untenable situation would explode in the worst possible way. The day David died. Thursday, March 3, 2011, began like most mornings in the Galarraga household, chaotic, tense, and unpredictable. The small two-bedroom apartment at Vista Lakes, a rundown complex in Jacksonville's Arlington neighborhood, was already stifling hot by 8:00 a.m. The air conditioning had been shut off months earlier when Bianca failed to pay the electric bill, and the March Florida heat was beginning to assert itself. Bianca Galarraga, now 25 years old and the mother of 4 children, woke up on the couch where she had passed out the night before. She was still wearing the same clothes she'd worn the previous day's sweatpants and a stained tank top. Doyle, her boyfriend, Pernell Williams, had been released from jail 3 days earlier after serving a 60-day sentence for violating his probation. He had spent the night at the apartment, but had left early that morning without saying where he was going. Bianca's 4 children were scattered throughout the small space. Her oldest daughter, 9-year-old Maria, was already awake, sitting on the floor watching cartoons on an old television set with a cracked screen. Her 5-year-old son, Carlos, was playing with a broken toy truck, rolling it back and forth across the stained carpet. And in the back bedroom, 12-year-old Cristian was still asleep, exhausted from a largely sleepless night. In a playpen in the corner of the living room stood 2-year-old David Galarraga, Bianca's youngest child. David was small for his age, weighing only 23 pounds, well below the average for a 2-year-old. His face was thin, his eyes large in his small face. He was wearing a saggy, clearly full diaper that should have been changed hours earlier. David was crying. He had been crying on and off for most of the night. He was hungry, uncomfortable, and seeking the comfort and attention that no one in the apartment seemed willing or able to provide. Bianca groaned and sat up on the couch, her head pounding from the combination of cheap alcohol and whatever pills she had taken the night before. She rubbed her eyes and looked around the apartment with barely concealed disgust. "Cristian!" she yelled, her voice hoarse. "Cristian, get out here!" There was no response from the bedroom. "Cristian!" she yelled again, louder this time. "I know you're awake. Get out here now!" After a moment, the bedroom door opened and Cristian emerged. He was wearing shorts and an oversized t-shirt, both dirty. His hair was disheveled, sticking up in several directions. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He looked at his mother warily, already tensing for whatever was about to happen. "Watch your brother," Bianca commanded, gesturing toward David. "I need to take a shower and try to get him to stop crying. He's been going on all night and my head is killing me." Cristian nodded silently. He never argued with his mother. Arguing only made things worse. Bianca disappeared into the bathroom, and moments later, the sound of running water filled the small apartment. Cristian walked over to the playpen where David stood, gripping the bars and continuing to cry. "Hey, David," Cristian said quietly. "It's okay. You're okay." But David wasn't okay. He was hungry, his diaper was soaked and uncomfortable, and he wanted his mother. At 2 years old, he couldn't articulate these needs, she could only cry. Cristian reached into the playpen and tried to lift David out, but the toddler stiffened his body and cried harder. This was typical. David had learned that when he was picked up, it was rarely for comfort. It was usually because he was being moved from one place to another, often roughly, often accompanied by yelling. "Come on, David," Cristian said, his voice strained. "I'm trying to help you." He managed to extract David from the playpen and carried him to the couch. David's cries intensified, his small fists clenching and unclenching, his face red and contorted. Cristian looked around desperately for something to calm the toddler. He grabbed a sippy cup from the coffee table and offered it to David, but it was empty. He found a pacifier on the floor, but when he tried to put it in David's mouth, the toddler turned his head away. "Please stop crying," Cristian pleaded. "Please." But David didn't stop. If anything, his cries grew louder, more insistent. Cristian felt a familiar tightness building in his chest, a combination of frustration, anxiety, and fear. He knew from experience that if he couldn't get David to stop crying, his mother would blame him. She would yell at him, maybe hit him. She would tell him he was useless, that he couldn't do anything right. He tried turning on the television, thinking maybe the distraction would help. But the cartoons that mesmerized Maria had no effect on David. He tried offering the toddler one of Carlos's toys. David knocked it away. "Come on, David," Cristian said, his voice rising. "Just stop. Please just stop." Maria looked over from where she was sitting. "Maybe he's hungry," she offered. Cristian went to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. It was nearly empty: a jar of mustard, a half-empty bottle of ketchup, some wilted lettuce. No milk, no juice, no food suitable for a toddler. He checked the cupboards. There were some crackers, but they were stale. He brought them over to David anyway, but the toddler was crying too hard to eat. The crying continued, and with each passing minute, Cristian felt something building inside him, a pressure, a heat, a feeling like he was going to explode. His hands were shaking. His heart was racing. He felt like he couldn't breathe. Years later, psychologists would explain that what Cristian was experiencing was a trauma response. His nervous system, constantly on high alert due to years of abuse, was being triggered by the stress of the situation. The crying, his inability to stop it, the fear of his mother's reaction of it, was activating his fight-or-flight response. But Cristian didn't understand any of that. All he knew was that he felt overwhelmed, trapped, and desperate. He picked David up again and carried him to the bedroom, thinking that maybe a change of environment would help. But David's crying only grew louder in the small, enclosed space. "Stop," Cristian said, his voice cracking. "Just stop." But David, who was 2 years old and who had known little but neglect and chaos in his short life, couldn't stop. He didn't know how to self-soothe. He didn't know how to calm himself down. He only knew how to cry. And that crying was about to trigger a catastrophe. The violent incident. In the bedroom, Cristian stood holding David, the toddler's cries reverberating in the small space. Cristian's arms were shaking, partly from the effort of holding the squirming child, partly from the overwhelming emotions flooding through him. He set David down on the floor, hoping that would help. But David immediately tried to crawl toward the door, still crying. Cristian blocked his path. "You can't go out there," Cristian said. "Mom said to keep you in here. Just stop crying." But David couldn't understand. He was 2 years old. He wanted his mother. He wanted food. He wanted comfort. And all he knew to do was cry. The sound of David's wailing filled Cristian's ears. It felt like it was getting louder, more intense, more unbearable, with each passing second. Cristian put his hands over his ears, trying to block out the noise, but it didn't help. In that moment, something inside Cristian snapped. Years of abuse, years of being told he was worthless, years of being punished for things beyond his control, years of being given responsibilities he was too young to handle all of it came crashing down at once. I said, "Stop." Cristian screamed. He grabbed David by the shoulders and shook him, hard. David's head snapped back and forth. His crying turned to gasps. "Stop, stop, stop!" Cristian shouted with each shake. And then, in a moment that would change both of their lives forever, Cristian pushed David. He pushed him with both hands, with all the force of his 12-year-old body, fueled by frustration and fear and rage that had been building for years. David's small body flew backward. He was only 23 pounds, barely more substantial than a bag of flour. He had no ability to break his fall or protect himself. His head struck the corner of a wooden bookshelf that leaned against the wall, a cheap, particle board unit that Bianca had bought at a thrift store. The impact made a sickening sound, not loud, but distinct, a dull, hollow thud. David crumpled to the floor and went silent. For a moment, there was absolute quiet. No crying. No noise at all. Cristian stood there, frozen, his chest heaving, his hands still extended in front of him from the push. His mind was blank. He couldn't think. He couldn't move. Then slowly, David began to make a sound. It wasn't crying anymore. It was a low, weak Moana sound that didn't seem entirely human. "David?" Cristian whispered. He dropped to his knees beside his brother. "David, are you okay?" David's eyes were open, but they weren't focused on anything. They seemed to be staring at nothing, looking through Cristian rather than at him. His small body was limp. Cristian touched David's arm. "David, can you hear me?" There was a small trickle of blood coming from David's nose. His head was tilted at an odd angle. His breathing was shallow and raspy. Panic flooded through Cristian. What had he done? What was he supposed to do now? He should call for help. He should get his mother. He should call 911. But fear paralyzed him. If he told his mother what happened, she would kill him. Williams would kill him. He would be beaten worse than he'd ever been beaten before. Maybe they would really hurt him this time. Maybe they would kill him. And if he called 911, if he told anyone what he'd done, he would get in trouble. Big trouble. Maybe he would go to jail. Maybe they would take him away and put him in one of those places for bad kids that he'd heard about. David made another weak sound. His eyes fluttered closed, then opened again. "It's okay," Cristian whispered, though he didn't know if he was talking to David or to himself. "You're going to be okay. You just need to sleep." With trembling hands, Cristian picked David up. The toddler's body was limp and heavy in a way it hadn't been before. His head lolled to the side. Cristian carried him to the crib that sat in the corner of the bedroom. Gently, carefully, he laid David down and covered him with a thin blanket. "You're okay," Cristian whispered again. "You're just sleeping." David's chest rose and fell, barely perceptible. His breathing was labored, rattling. Cristian backed away from the crib, his heart pounding. He stood there for a moment, staring at the still form of his brother. And then he turned and walked out of the room, closing the door behind him. Cristian's response and cover-up. Cristian stood in the hallway outside the bedroom, his back against the closed door. His entire body was shaking. His mind was racing, but his thoughts were fragmented, incoherent. What had he done? Was David okay? Should he tell someone? What would happen to him? From the bathroom, he could still hear the sound of the shower running. His mother was still in there. She hadn't heard anything. Maybe that was good. Maybe if he just didn't say anything, everything would be fine. David was sleeping. That's what Cristian told himself. David was just sleeping. He would wake up later and be fine. Cristian walked into the living room where Maria and Carlos were still watching television. Neither of them looked up. They hadn't heard what happened in the bedroom. Or if they had learned, like Cristian had learned, that it was better to ignore things, to pretend not to notice, to keep your head down and stay out of trouble. Cristian sat down on the couch. He tried to watch the television, tried to focus on the bright colors and cartoon characters, but he couldn't. His hands were still shaking. His heart was still racing. Minutes passed. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15. The shower turned off. Cristian tensed. A few minutes later, Bianca emerged from the bathroom, a towel wrapped around her head, wearing clean clothes. She looked at Cristian. "Where's David?" she asked. Cristian's throat felt tight. "He's sleeping," he managed to say. "In his crib." Bianca nodded, apparently satisfied. "Good. Finally got him to shut up, huh?" Cristian nodded, not trusting his voice. Bianca went into the kitchen and lit a cigarette. She stood there smoking, looking at her phone, scrolling through text messages. Cristian sat on the couch, not moving. His mind kept going back to David lying in the crib. He kept seeing David's unfocused eyes, hearing that weak, rattling breath. He should check on him. He should make sure he was okay. But he was too afraid. If David was truly hurting, Cristian went to check on him. Then he would have to do something. He would have to tell someone. And he couldn't face that. So instead, he sat there. He sat there and told himself that David was fine, that he was just sleeping, that everything would be okay. Time passed. An hour. Then 2 hours. Around noon, Pernell Williams came back to the apartment. He was in a foul mood, slamming the door, cursing about something that had happened while he was out. He demanded that Bianca make him something to eat. She argued that there was no food. He accused her of wasting money on drugs. They screamed at each other. Cristian sat on the couch through all of this, barely moving, barely breathing. No one paid any attention to him. No one asked about David. More time passed. Another hour. Then, another. And in the back bedroom, in a crib covered with a thin blanket, David Galarraga's breathing grew shallower and shallower. Discovery in 911 call at approximately 2:00 p.m., more than 3 hours after David had been injured. Bianca finally decided to check on him. "He's been sleeping a long time," she said to no one in particular. "I should make sure he's okay." Cristian's heart dropped into his stomach. He wanted to say something, to stop her, but the words wouldn't come. Bianca walked to the bedroom and opened the door. A few seconds passed, and then she screamed. "Oh my God! Oh my God! David! David!" Cristian heard her footsteps running back into the living room. She was carrying David's limp body in her arms. His skin was pale, almost gray. His lips had a bluish tint. His eyes were half open but unseeing. "He's not breathing," Bianca screamed. "He won't wake up. Oh God, what happened?" She laid David on the floor and put her ear to his chest. "I can't hear a heartbeat. Someone call 911. Williams grabbed his phone and dialed. Bianca began attempting CPR, though it was clear she didn't really know what she was doing. She was panicking, hyperventilating, crying. 911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's calm voice came through the phone speaker. "My girlfriend's baby," Williams said, his voice uncharacteristically shaken. "He's not breathing. He's not responding." "How old is the child?" 2 years old. "What happened?" Williams looked at Bianca, who was still trying desperately to revive David. "I don't know. She just found him like this." The dispatcher gave instructions. "Is the child on a hard, flat surface?" "Yes." "Well, is someone performing CPR?" "She's trying to." The dispatcher walked them through proper CPR technique. Bianca tried to follow the instructions, but her hands were shaking too badly to be effective. "How long has the child been unconscious?" Bianca looked up, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know. I just found him. He was supposed to be sleeping." Paramedics arrived at 2:21 p.m., 7 minutes after the 911 call. They rushed into the apartment with their equipment and immediately took over from Bianca. They checked David's vital signs. No pulse. No respiration. His skin was cool to the touch. One of the paramedics looked at his partner with an expression that said what he couldn't say out loud. This child had been in distress for hours. They began advanced life support intubation, chest compressions, medications. They loaded David onto a gurney and rushed him to the ambulance. "We're taking him to Shands, Jacksonville," one paramedic told Bianca. "You can ride with us." As they rushed out, Cristian remained on the couch, watching everything unfold as if from a great distance. No one asked him what happened. No one looked at him. Not yet. Hospital and David's death. The ambulance screamed through Jacksonville traffic, sirens wailing, lights flashing. In the back, paramedics worked frantically on David's small body. They administered epinephrine. They performed chest compression. They did everything in their power to restart his heart. But David had been without adequate oxygen to his brain for hours. The damage was catastrophic. At Shands Jacksonville Medical Center, the trauma team was waiting. David was rushed into the emergency room and surrounded by doctors and nurses. They continued advanced life support. They performed ultrasounds to assess brain activity. They consulted specialists. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the attending physician, examined David and ordered an emergency CT scan. The results confirmed her worst fears: massive brain swelling, subdural hematoma, skull fracture. These injuries are not recent, Dr. Reynolds told her team. This child has been in critical condition for hours. They performed emergency surgery to relieve pressure on David's brain. But it was too late. The swelling was too severe. The damage was irreversible. In the waiting room, Bianca sat with her head in her hands, rocking back and forth, sobbing. William sat next to her, stone-faced. Security had already called the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office to report a suspicious injury to a child. Detectives were on their way. At 10:47 p.m., 8 hours after he first struck his head, David Galarraga was pronounced dead. He was 2 years and 7 months old. Dr. Reynolds walked out to inform the family. Bianca collapsed, her screams echoing through the hospital corridors. A nurse approached Bianca gently. "I'm so sorry for your loss. The police are here and need to speak with you." Bianca looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Police? Why?" "It's standard procedure when a child dies," the nurse explained. "They just need to ask some questions." But it wasn't standard procedure. It was the beginning of a homicide investigation. The investigation? Crime scene investigation. Detective Raymond Lopez of the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Homicide Division arrived at the Vista Lakes apartment complex at 11:34 p.m. on March 3, 2011. He was a 20-year veteran of the force, having worked hundreds of cases ranging from domestic disputes to gang-related shootings. But cases involving the death of a toddler were always the hardest. They stayed with you, haunted you, long after the paperwork was filed. Lopez was met in the parking lot by uniformed officers who had secured the scene. They briefed him on what they knew so far. A 2-year-old boy had been found unresponsive in his home, transported to Shands Jacksonville Medical Center, and pronounced dead. The attending physician had noted injuries inconsistent with an accidental fall or natural causes. This was now being treated as a suspicious death investigation. "Who's in the apartment?" Lopez asked. "3 other children ages 9, 5, and 12, one officer replied. "We've separated them. The 12-year-old is in the back bedroom. The other 2 are in the living room with a social worker who just arrived. The mother and her boyfriend are still at the hospital being interviewed." Lopez nodded. "Anyone leave the scene?" "No, sir. We locked it down as soon as we got the call from the hospital." Lopez pulled on latex gloves and entered the apartment. The first thing that hit him was the smell, a nauseating combination of cigarette smoke, rotting food, dirty diapers, and general filth. He had been in hundreds of homes during his career, but this was among the worst. The living room was cluttered with trash. Fast food wrappers, empty soda bottles, and overflowing ashtrays covered every surface. A pile of dirty laundry sat in one corner, and the carpet was stained with substances Lopez didn't want to identify. A forensic photographer moved through the space, systematically documenting everything. Lopez watched as she photographed the general disarray, then focused on specific items: a playpen in the corner, a couch with torn cushions, the kitchen with its empty refrigerator and sink full of dishes. "Make sure you get detailed shots of the living conditions," Lopez instructed. "This is evidence of neglect." He moved down the narrow hallway toward the bedrooms. The first bedroom was clearly where the children slept or tried to. There was one full-size mattress on the floor with no sheets, surrounded by scattered toys and dirty clothes. The room smelled of urine. The second bedroom was slightly larger. This was where, according to the initial reports, David had been found. Lopez entered carefully, his eyes scanning every detail. Against one wall stood a cheap wooden bookshelf, the kind sold at discount stores for $20. It was leaning slightly, unstable. Lopez examined it closely. On one corner, at about the height where a toddler's head might strike if he fell or was pushed, there was a small but visible discoloration, possibly blood. "Bag this," Lopez told the forensic tech who had followed him in. "I want it processed for blood evidence and trace materials." In the corner of the room was a portable playpen-style crib with mesh sides. Inside was a thin blanket and a stuffed animal that had seen better days. No sheets, no pillow. Lopez photographed the crib from multiple angles. On the floor near the bookshelf, there was a small spot that appeared to be blood. It had been partially smeared, as if someone had stepped on it or tried to wipe it away. Lopez marked it for the forensic team. He stood in the center of the room, trying to reconstruct what had happened. A 2-year-old child had received catastrophic head injuries in this room. The question was, how? And more importantly, who was responsible? Lopez knew from experience that when a child dies in the home, the first suspects are always the adults responsible for the child's care. But according to the initial reports, there had been no adults home when David was injured, only a 12-year-old child left to babysit. "Bring the 12-year-old to the station," Lopez told one of the uniformed officers. "We need to talk to him." Bianca's interrogation. While the crime scene was being processed, Detective Maria Sanchez was at Shands Jacksonville Medical Center interviewing Bianca Galarraga. Sanchez was a skilled interrogator, known for her ability to build rapport with witnesses and suspects alike. She had a gentle demeanor that often put people at ease, making them more willing to talk. She found Bianca in a small consultation room off the main waiting area. Bianca was sitting in a plastic chair, her body hunched forward, her face buried in her hands. She was still crying, her shoulders shaking with sob. "Miss Galarraga," Sanchez said softly, taking a seat across from her. "I'm Detective Sanchez with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. I'm very sorry for your loss. I know this is an incredibly difficult time, but I need to ask you some questions about what happened today. Can you do that for me?" Bianca looked up. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face blotchy from crying. She nodded weakly. "Thank you," Sanchez said. She placed a digital recorder on the table between them. "I'm going to record our conversation, okay? This is just so we have an accurate record. Is that all right with you?" "Okay," Bianca whispered. Sanchez pressed record and stated the date, time, and location for the record. Then she began. "Can you tell me what happened today? Start from the beginning of the day." Bianca took a shaky breath. "I woke up around 8, maybe 8:30. David was crying. He cries a lot. I asked Cristian to watch him while I took a shower." "Cristian is your 12-year-old son?" "Yes." "And David is 2 years old, correct?" "Yes. 2 years and 7 months." "Okay. So you asked Cristian to watch David while you showered. What time was that? Maybe 9:30? 10? I don't know exactly." "And how long were you in the shower?" "I don't know. Maybe 20 minutes? Half an hour?" "And when you came out of the shower, where was David?" "Cristian said he was sleeping in his crib. I didn't think anything of it. David takes naps during the day. Did you check on him?" Bianca hesitated. "No, I thought he was sleeping." "What did you do after your shower?" I was in the living room, watching TV, on my phone. Just hanging out. And Cristian, he was in the living room too. Did he seem upset or worried about anything?" Bianca thought about this. "He was quiet. But Cristian is always quiet. He doesn't talk much." "Did you check on David at any point during the day?" "Not until later, around 2 o'clock. I thought he'd been sleeping a long time, so I went to check on him. And when I went in the room," her voice broke. "He wasn't moving. His skin was gray. I picked him up and he was limp and cold and I couldn't feel a heartbeat, and I screamed for Pernell, that's my boyfriend, and he called 911, and I tried to do CPR, but I didn't know if I was doing it right. And oh God, my baby, my baby." She dissolved into sobs again. Sanchez waited patiently, then asked gently, "Ms. Galarraga, when you put David in his crib that morning, was he okay? Did he have any injuries?" "No, he was fine," he was crying. But he was fine. The doctors at the hospital say David had a skull fracture and brain hemorrhage. Do you have any idea how that could have happened? Bianca's eyes widened. A skull fracture? No, I don't know. Maybe he fell out of his crib? The crib has mesh sides. It's very difficult for a child to fall out of that type of crib, and even if he did, the fall wouldn't cause the kind of injuries David sustained. Then, I don't know. I don't know what happened. I wasn't in the room. Who was in the room with David? Cristian. Just Cristian. And you left Cristian, a 12-year-old, alone to watch a 2-year-old for several hours? Bianca's expression shifted from grief to defensiveness. Cristian watches his brothers and sisters all the time. He's responsible. He's never hurt anyone before. Has Cristian ever been violent? Ever gotten into fights or hurt anyone? He gets in trouble at school sometimes, fighting with other kids, but that's because they pick on him. He's not a violent kid. Miss Galarraga, David had bruises on his body in various stages of healing. Old bruises. Can you explain those? Bianca's hands twisted together in her lap. He's a toddler. Toddlers fall down and bump into things. That's normal. The pattern of bruising is consistent with abuse, not accidental injury. I didn't abuse my son. Bianca's voice rose. I loved him. I love all my kids. Sanchez leaned forward slightly. I believe you loved him, but I need you to tell me the truth about what's been happening in your home. Has David been hurt before? Has someone been hurting him? Bianca was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Pernell, sometimes he loses his temper. With all the kids. He doesn't mean to hurt them. He gets frustrated. Nay. Has Pernell hurt David before? He spanked him when David wouldn't stop crying, but nothing serious. Nothing that would. Has Cristian ever hurt David? No. Cristian is good with his brothers and sisters. He takes care of them. But he was alone with David this morning. Yes. And David is now dead from head trauma. Bianca's face crumpled. Oh God. Oh God. Did he do something? That's what we're trying to find out. Cristian's confession. At 1:47 a.m. on March 4, 2011, Cristian Fernandez was brought into interview room 3 at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. He had been sitting in a holding room with a victim advocate for over 2 hours while detectives processed the scene and interviewed his mother. No one had told him yet that David was dead. Detective Raymond Lopez entered the room and took a seat across from Cristian. The boy looked tiny in the adult-sized chair, his feet dangling several inches above the floor. He was still wearing the same clothes he'd been wearing all day, shorts and a t-shirt. He hadn't been given anything to eat or drink. He looked exhausted, scared, and very, very young. Cristian, my name is Detective Lopez, the detective said, his tone as gentle as he could make it. I need to talk to you about what happened today with your brother David. But before we start, I need to tell you about your rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in court. You have the right to have a lawyer present during questioning. If you can't afford a lawyer, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights? Cristian nodded. I need you to say it out loud for the recording. Yes, I understand. Okay. Knowing these rights, are you willing to talk to me? Cristian nodded again. Yes. In retrospect, this would become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Cristian was 12 years old, with borderline intellectual disability and severe trauma. He was being interrogated in the middle of the night without a parent or attorney present. Defense attorneys would later argue that his confession should be inadmissible because he didn't fully understand his rights and couldn't have knowingly waived them. But in that moment, in that room, Lopez proceeded with the interview. Cristian, I need you to tell me what happened today. Can you do that? Cristian stared at the table. His voice, when he spoke, was barely audible. Is David okay? Lopez hesitated. No. He had to tell the truth, but he also knew that once Cristian learned his brother was dead, the interview might be over. David is hurt very badly. The doctors tried to help him, but his injuries were too severe. David died tonight. Cristian's face went completely blank. He didn't cry. He didn't react at all. He just stared. "Do you understand what I just told you?" Lopez asked gently. "He's dead." "Yes, I'm sorry." Cristian continued to stare. No tears. No emotion. Just a blank, hollow look. "Cristian, I need you to tell me what happened. What happened to David today?" There was a long silence. Then, in a voice so quiet Lopez had to lean forward to hear, Cristian said, "I pushed him." "You pushed David?" "Yes. Yes. Can you tell me more about that? What was happening when you pushed him?" "He was crying. He wouldn't stop crying. I tried to make him stop, but he wouldn't. And I got mad." "Where were you when this happened?" "In the bedroom." "What happened after you pushed him?" "He fell and hit his head on the bookshelf." "Did he hit his head hard?" Cristian nodded. There was a sound, like a thump. "What did David do after he hit his head?" "He stopped crying. He just laid there." "Did you call for help?" Cristian shook his head. "Why not?" "I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared I would get in trouble." "What did you do?" "I put him in his crib. I thought he was sleeping." "Did you tell your mother what happened?" "No, thank you." "Why not?" "I don't know. I was scared." Over the next hour, Lopez asked Cristian to repeat the story multiple times, looking for inconsistencies. The basic facts remained the same. David had been crying. Cristian had gotten frustrated. He had pushed David. David had hit his head on the bookshelf, and Cristian had not sought help. But some details changed. In one telling, Cristian said he pushed David once. In another, he said he might have pushed him more than once. He couldn't remember. In one version, he said David fell backward into the bookshelf. In another, he said he might have pushed David directly against the bookshelf. These inconsistencies would later become important. The prosecution would argue that they showed Cristian was minimizing his actions, trying to make them sound less violent than they really were. The defense would argue that they showed a traumatized, intellectually limited child who was confused, exhausted, and didn't fully understand what had happened. "Cristian, did you mean to hurt David?" Lopez asked. Cristian shook his head. "No, I just wanted him to stop crying." "Did you know that pushing him could hurt him?" Cristian hesitated. "I guess. I don't know. I wasn't thinking." "Are you sorry about what happened?" Cristian nodded. And for the first time since learning of David's death, tears began to stream down his face. Autopsy findings. The autopsy on David Galarraga was performed by Dr. Valerie Rao, Chief Medical Examiner for Jacksonville, on the morning of March 4th, 2011. Dr. Rao was a highly respected forensic pathologist with over 30 years of experience. She had performed thousands of autopsies, including many on children. But each case involving a child was difficult, and this one was particularly tragic. David's small body lay on the examination table. Even in death, it was clear that he had been a neglected child. He weighed only 23 pounds, well below the average for a 2-year-old. His ribs were visible through his skin. His arms and legs were thin, showing signs of malnutrition. Dr. Rao began with an external examination, photographing and documenting every mark on David's body. What she found was deeply disturbing. David had bruises in various stages of healing covering his arms, legs, back, and buttocks. Some were fresh purple and red, consistent with injuries sustained within the past 24 to 48 hours. Others were older yellowing and fading, indicating they were at least a week old. Still, others were even older, having turned to a faint greenish brown. The pattern and location of the bruises were consistent with inflicted trauma, not accidental injury. Children who fall during normal play typically have bruises on their knees, shins, forehead bony prominences that take the impact of a fall. David's bruises were on soft tissue areaceous upper arms, his thighs, his back places, that are much more likely to be bruised during abuse. But the most significant findings came from the internal examination. When Dr. Rao opened David's skull, she found massive trauma. Most significantly, David's skull was fractured. The fracture extended from the left parietal bone, the side of the head, backward toward the occipital bone, the back of the head. It was a linear fracture, approximately 4 inches long. Dr. Rao also found contusions bruising on David's brain tissue itself, indicating that the brain had been violently shaken or impacted. The cause of death is blunt force trauma to the head, Dr. Rao dictated into her recorder. The manner of death is homicide. She paused, looking at the small body on her table. In her report, she would write, "The severity of the cranial injuries, combined with the presence of multiple bruises in various stages of healing, is consistent with repeated physical abuse. This child died as a result of inflicted head trauma, and he had been abuzzed for a significant period prior to his death." The arrest and charges. On March 7, 2011, 4 days after David's death, the state attorney's office made a decision that would shock the nation and ignite a fierce debate about juvenile justice. Cristian Fernandez would be charged as an adult with first-degree murder. The announcement came at a press conference held by State Attorney Angela Corey. Corey was a controversial figure in Jacksonville, tough-on-crime prosecutor who had built her career on aggressive charging decisions and high conviction rates. She was not afraid of difficult cases or media scrutiny. "This is a tragic case," Corey said, standing at a podium surrounded by reporters. "A 2-year-old child is dead as a result of violent actions by the defendant. While we recognize that the defendant is himself a child, the law allows and, in this case, requires that he be charged as an adult." What? Under Florida law, the state attorney has the discretion to charge juveniles as adults in cases involving serious felonies, including murder. The decision is not made by a judge or a jury, it is made by the prosecutor alone. The evidence in this case shows that Cristian Fernandez deliberately and violently attacked his 2-year-old brother, causing catastrophic injuries that resulted in his death. Corey continued. The defendant then failed to seek help for his dying brother for hours. This was not an accident. This was not a momentary lapse. This was a sustained act of violence followed by a conscious decision not to help. And that is why we are charging first-degree murder. The legal battle, public reaction and debate. The news that a 12-year-old boy had been charged as an adult with first-degree murder spread rapidly. Within hours, the story was trending on social media. Within days, it had become a national news sensation. Cable news networks devoted segments to the case. Legal analysts debated the ethics of the decision, and advocacy groups on both sides began mobilizing. On one side were those who believed that Cristian deserved compassion and rehabilitation, not a life sentence. Organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, the Children's Defense Fund, and the Juvenile Law Center issued statements condemning the decision to try Cristian as an adult. "This is a child who has been failed by every system designed to protect him," read a statement from the ACLU. Cristian Fernandez was born into violence, raised in chaos, and subjected to horrific abuse throughout his entire childhood. To now treat him as an adulto, potentially sentence him to die in prison is not justice, it is vengeance. Prominent child psychologists and trauma experts weighed in, citing research on brain development and the effects of trauma on children. Dr. Bruce Perry, a leading expert on childhood trauma and the developing brain, gave an interview to CNN in which he explained that children like Cristian often lack the cognitive and emotional tools to regulate their behavior. When a child grows up in an environment of extreme violence and neglect, their brain develops differently, Dr. Perry explained. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and understanding consequences, doesn't develop properly. These children are essentially living in survival mode all the time, and when they're pushed beyond their capacity to cope, they may react in ways that seem violent or extreme, but that in their minds feel like survival. Petitions calling for Cristian's release garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures. Protests were held outside the Duval County Courthouse. Celebrities and activists took to social media to express their outrage. But not everyone was sympathetic to Cristian. On the other side of the debate were victims' advocates and those who believed that accountability mattered, regardless of age. They argued that David Galarraga, an innocent 2-year-old, deserved justice. "We cannot let sympathy for the defendant overshadow the reality of what happened here," said a spokesperson for the National Organization for Victim Assistance. "A toddler is dead. He died from violent injuries inflicted by his brother, who then failed to seek help. That is not an accident. That is not a momentary lapse. That is a choice, and there must be consequences for that choice." Conservative commentators argued that the trend toward leniency for juvenile offenders had gone too far, and that cases like this demonstrated the need for tough consequences even for young offenders. The debate raged in op-ed pages on talk shows and in living rooms across America. It touched on fundamental questions about childhood, accountability, trauma, and justice. Can a child who has been horrifically abused be held to the same standard as an adult? At what age does a person become responsible for their actions? And how do we balance compassion with justice? These were questions without easy answers. And at the center of the storm was a 12-year-old boy sitting in a juvenile detention cell, waiting to learn his fate. Certification hearing. Before Cristian's case could proceed to trial in adult court, there had to be a certification hearing. This hearing would determine whether Cristian would remain in the adult system or be transferred to juvenile court. The hearing was scheduled for July 15, 2011, and would be presided over by Judge Mallory Cooper. Judge Cooper was a respected jurist known for her thoughtful, deliberate approach to the law. She had been on the bench for 15 years and had handled many difficult cases, but this one presented unique challenges. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled with reporters, legal observers, victims' advocates, and members of the public. Outside, protesters held signs reading "Justice for David," others reading "Children are not adults." Cristian entered the courtroom in shackles, flanked by his public defenders, Jay Plotkin and Rebecca Santos. He wore clothes that had been carefully selected to make him look as young as possible, khaki pants and a button-down shirt that was slightly too big. His hair had been neatly combed. He looked scared and small. Judge Cooper took her seat and reviewed the documents before her. Then she looked up and addressed the courtroom. "This hearing will determine whether the defendant," where Mizrahi had been forceful and focused on the crime, Plotkin was empathetic and focused on Cristian's history. "Your Honor," Plotkin began, "this case is a tragedy on every level. What happened to David Galarraga was a tragedy, but what happened to Cristian Fernandez throughout his entire life is also a tragedy. And if we are to make a just decision about how to proceed, we must understand the full context of that tragedy." Plotkin spent the next 30 minutes walking the court through Cristian's life history. He presented medical records documenting the abuse Cristian had suffered: the broken leg at age 4, the hospitalizations, the evidence of malnutrition, and neglect. He presented CPS records showing that the agency had been notified of abuse on multiple occasions and had failed to adequately intervene. He showed photographs of the Vista Lakes apartment filth, the squalor, the evidence of profound neglect. He read aloud from teachers' reports documenting Cristian's cries for help that had gone unanswered. "Cristian Fernandez did not choose to be born into violence," Plotkin said, his voice rising with emotion. "He did not choose to be abused, neglected, and abandoned. He did not choose to have a mother who was herself a victim of abuse and who was completely incapable of providing proper care. He did not choose to live in an environment where violence was the norm, where crying brought punishment, where asking for help was futile." Plotkin argued that charging Cristian as an adult violated the fundamental principles of juvenile justice. The juvenile system, he explained, was founded on the recognition that children are different from adults, that their brains are still developing, that they lack the capacity for adult judgment, and that they have a greater capacity for rehabilitation. "Your Honor, the United States Supreme Court has repeatedly recognized that children are different," Plotkin said. In Roper v. Simmons, The court held that juveniles cannot be executed. In Graham v. Florida, the court held that juveniles cannot be sentenced to life without parole for non-homicide offenses. And the reasoning in those cases is clear: children are less culpable than adults because they have less capacity for mature judgment, they are more vulnerable to external influences, and their character is not yet fully formed. Plotkin argued that trying Cristian as an adult, subjecting him to the possibility of life in prison without parole, was fundamentally unjust. Cristian needs treatment, not punishment, Plotkin concluded. He needs intensive therapy to address the trauma he has suffered. He needs education. He needs to be in an environment where he can heal and develop the skills he was never taught. The juvenile system can provide that. The adult system cannot. Your Honor, we urge you to transfer this case to juvenile court. Expert testimony. The certification hearing continued with expert testimony. The defense called Dr. Michael Brannon, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated Cristian extensively. Dr. Brannon took the stand and was sworn in. He had a calm, professional demeanor and spoke in clear, accessible language designed to help the judge understand complex psychological concepts. J. Plotkin began his direct examination. Dr. Brannon, can you tell the court about your qualifications? Dr. Brannon outlined his credentials: a Ph.D. in clinical psychology, board certification in forensic psychology, over 20 years of experience evaluating juvenile offenders, and numerous publications in peer-reviewed journals. And have you had the opportunity to evaluate Cristian Fernandez? Yes, I've met with him on multiple occasions over the past several months. In total, I've spent approximately 50 hours with him, conducting clinical interviews, administering psychological tests, and reviewing records. And what did you find? Dr. Brannon referred to the thick report on his lap. Cristian suffers from several serious mental health conditions. He meets the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, reactive attachment disorder, and major depressive disorder. He also has borderline intellectual functioning, with an IQ of 79. Can you explain what those diagnoses mean? Certainly. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a condition that develops after exposure to traumatic events. In Cristian's case, he has been exposed to chronic, sustained trauma throughout his entire life: physical abuse, sexual abuse within his family, domestic violence, neglect. Children with PTSD often have intrusive memories, nightmares. Dr. Brannon continued, reactive attachment disorder develops when a child does not form healthy emotional bonds with caregivers during the critical early years of development. This usually happens when caregivers are abusive, neglectful, or frequently changing. Children with RAD have difficulty trusting others, forming relationships, and understanding social cues. And how do these conditions affect Cristian's behavior? They affect him profoundly. Cristian's brain has developed in an environment of extreme stress and danger. As a result, his nervous system is essentially stuck in survival mode. His amygdala part of the brain that processes fear and emotion is overactive. His prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for impulse, control, planning, and understanding. Dr. Brannon explained that when Cristian is in a high-stress situation, such as a crying toddler who won't be comforted, his brain essentially short-circuits. His fight-or-flight response activates, flooding his body with adrenaline and cortisol. In that state, his ability to think rationally, to control his impulses, to understand the consequences of his actions, is severely impaired. It's not that Cristian chose to hurt his brother, Dr. Brannon said. It's that in that moment, his traumatized brain responded to the stress in the only way it knew how, with aggression. It was a survival response, not a calculated decision. Plotkin asked, in your professional opinion, could Cristian have prevented what happened if he had received proper treatment and support? Absolutely. If Cristian had been provided with trauma-informed therapy, if he had been removed from the abusive environment, If he had been taught emotional regulation skills and given proper supervision, this tragedy would not have occurred. Cristian needed help. He asked for help repeatedly, and the systems that were supposed to provide that help failed him. In your opinion, can Cristian be rehabilitated? Yes, with appropriate treatment. Cristian is 12 years old. His brain is still developing. With intensive trauma therapy, educational support, and a stable, safe environment, he has the capacity to heal and to develop into a functioning adult. But that can only happen in a therapeutic environment, not in an adult prison. On cross-examination, Prosecutor Alan Mizrahi challenged some of Dr. Brannon's conclusions. Dr. Brannon, you testified that Cristian's actions were a survival response. But after he pushed David, he made a conscious decision not to seek help, correct? That's correct. That wasn't a fight-or-flight response. That was a decision made after the immediate crisis had passed. Yes, but that decision was also influenced by his trauma history. Cristian had learned through repeated experience that telling adults what had happened would result in punishment for him. His failure to seek help was rooted in fear, not malice. But he understood that David was hurt. On some level, yes. And he understood that David needed help. Dr. Brannon hesitated. I believe Cristian recognized that something was wrong, but I don't think he fully grasped the severity of David's condition or the urgency of the situation. His capacity to assess the situation and respond appropriately was impaired by his trauma and his limited intellectual functioning. The testimony continued for several more hours, with both sides presenting their arguments about Cristian's mental state, his capacity for rehabilitation, and the appropriate venue for his case. Judge's ruling. After 2 full days of testimony, Judge Cooper announced that she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written ruling within 30 days. For Cristian, those 30 days were agonizing. He remained in a juvenile detention facility, housed separately from the other juveniles due to the severity of the charges against him. He spent most of his time alone in a small cell, with 1 hour per day of recreation time in a fenced outdoor area. He met with his attorneys regularly. They tried to prepare him for both possible outcomes: transfer to juvenile court or remaining in adult court. But it was difficult to explain the stakes to a 12-year-old with borderline intellectual disability and severe trauma. Cristian struggled to understand why any of this was happening, why David's death meant he might spend the rest of his life in prison. On August 12, 2011, Judge Cooper issued her ruling. The courtroom was once again packed as she read her decision from the bench. This court has carefully considered all of the evidence, the testimony of the experts, and the arguments of both counsel. Judge Cooper began. The defendant, Cristian Fernandez, has endured horrific abuse throughout his young life. The failures of the adults in his life and of the systems designed to protect him are unconscionable. There was a pause. Everyone in the courtroom held their breath. However, Judge Cooper continued, this court must also consider the severity of the offense, the nature of the injuries inflicted, and the fact that the defendant failed to seek help for his dying brother. After careful deliberation, this court finds that the state attorney's decision to charge the defendant as an adult was within the bounds of prosecutorial discretion. The motion to transfer this case. The courtroom erupted. Cristian's attorneys immediately announced they would appeal. Advocates shouted in protest. And Cristian, sitting at the defense table, put his head in his hand. Plea negotiations. In the months following Judge Cooper's ruling, plea negotiations began in earnest. The defense team knew that taking the case to trial was an enormous risk. If a jury convicted Cristian of first-degree murder, he would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die behind bars. The prosecution offered a deal: plead guilty to aggravated manslaughter of a child and accept a sentence of 15 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation. It was a significant reduction from a life sentence, but it was still an extraordinarily harsh punishment for a 12-year-old child. 15 years meant Cristian would be 27 years old when he was released, more than twice his current age. Jay Plotkin presented the offer to Cristian and his family. He explained the risks of going to trial. He explained that a jury might not be sympathetic to a child defendant when the victim was a toddler. He explained that the evidence of Cristian's confession, the autopsy findings, the delay in seeking help, was damaging. But Cristian, with the limited understanding he had, refused the deal. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said. "I want people to know I didn't mean to kill him." The case would go to trial. The trial, jury selection, and opening statements. The trial of Cristian Fernandez began on October 31, 2011, Halloween. The date seemed grimly appropriate for a case that had become a national nightmare, a case that forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about childhood, trauma, and justice. Jury selection had taken 3 weeks. Finding 12 impartial jurors in a case this publicized was nearly impossible. Every potential juror had heard about the case. Many had already formed opinions. The attorneys on both sides used their peremptory challenges strategically, trying to seat a jury that might be sympathetic to their side. The prosecution sought jurors who would focus on the facts of the crime: the dead toddler, the fractured skull, the delay in seeking help. The defense sought jurors who had some understanding of childhood trauma, who could see Cristian as a victim as well as a perpetrator. Finally, a jury was seated, 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 25 to 68. They came from different backgrounds: teachers, retirees, construction workers, office administrators. But they all shared one thing: the awesome responsibility of deciding a child's fate. The trial officially began at 9:00 a.m. on Halloween. Judge Cooper took her seat and addressed the packed courtroom. "This is a serious matter," she said. "I expect everyone in this courtroom, attorneys, witnesses, spectators, and members of the media, to conduct themselves with the dignity and respect this case deserves. This is not entertainment. This is a search for truth and justice." She turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard some things about this case during jury selection. But now you will hear the evidence. It is your duty to listen carefully, to weigh the evidence fairly, and to reach a verdict based solely on what you hear in this courtroom. Are you ready to proceed?" The jurors nodded. "Mr. Mizrahi, you may give your opening statement." Prosecutor Alan Mizrahi stood and approached the jury. He was dressed in a dark suit, his expression serious but not unkind. He knew that this was a difficult case for everyone involved, but he had a job to do. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is about a 2-year-old boy named David Galarraga. David should be 4 years old now. He should be playing with his friends, going to preschool, learning his ABS. But David will never do any of those things, because on March 3, 2011, his life was taken from him by his 12-year-old brother, the defendant, Cristian Fernandez." Mizrahi displayed a photograph of David on a large screen, a picture taken just weeks before his death. David was smiling, his brown eyes bright, his chubby cheeks dimpled. Several jurors visibly softened at the sight. Mizrahi walked the jury through the events of March 3, 2011. He described how Cristian had been left to watch David, how David had been crying, how Cristian had become frustrated. And then he described the violence. "The defendant pushed David with such force that his skull fractured," Mizrahi said. "David's head struck the bookshelf, and he suffered catastrophic brain injuries. But here's the critical point. The defendant did not call for help. He did not alert his mother. He placed his dying brother in a crib and walked away. For hours, David lay there, his brain swelling, his condition deteriorating. And by the time anyone sought medical attention, it was too late." Mizrahi's voice was steady, controlled. "The defense will tell you that the defendant is a victim of abuse, and that may be true. But David Galarraga was also a victim. He was a defenseless toddler who died a violent, preventable death. And it is your duty to hold the defendant accountable." Jay Plotkin rose for the defense's opening statement. His approach was different, softer, more narrative, more focused on humanizing Cristian. "Ladies and gentlemen, what happened to David Galarraga was a tragedy," Plotkin said. "But this case is not just about March 3rd. It's about the 12 years that came before. It's about a boy who was born from rape, raised in violence, and failed by every adult who was supposed to protect him." Plotkin walked the jury through Cristian's life, the abuse, the neglect, the CPS failure. He showed photographs of Cristian's injuries, read medical records documenting the violence he had suffered. "Cristian Fernandez is not a killer," Plotkin said. "He is a child who was pushed beyond his breaking point. And what happened on March 3rd was not murder. It was a tragic accident." Prosecution's case. Over the next 2 weeks, the prosecution presented a methodical, evidence-driven case. They called 23 witnesses, including first responders, detectives, medical examiners, and forensic experts. Paramedic Thomas Wright testified about arriving at the Vista Lakes apartment on March 3, 2011. He described finding David unresponsive, the frantic attempts to revive him, and the grim realization that the child had been in critical condition for hours before anyone called for help. "In my professional opinion," Wright testified, "if we had been called immediately after the injury occurred, David might have survived. But by the time we arrived, the damage was too extensive." Detective Raymond Lopez testified about the crime scene investigation. He described the condition of the apartment, the filth, the neglect, the evidence of poverty. He showed photographs of the bookshelf where David had struck his head, pointing out the bloodstain on the corner. Lopez also testified about Cristian's interrogation. The prosecution played a video of the interview, and the jury watched as 12-year-old Cristian, small and scared, admitted to pushing David. On cross-examination, J. Plotkin challenged the circumstances of the interrogation. "Detective Lopez, when you interviewed Cristian, it was the middle of the night, correct?" "Yes, approximately 1:47 a.m. "And Cristian had been awake for over 17 hours at that point?" "I believe so, yes." "And he had just learned that his brother had died?" "Yes." "Was a parent or attorney present during the interrogation?" "No." Cristian was read his Miranda rights and waived them. He was 12 years old with an IQ of 79. "Do you believe he fully understood those rights?" "He said he understood." "That's not what I asked. Do you, as an experienced detective, believe that a traumatized 12-year-old with borderline intellectual disability fully comprehended what he was waiving when he agreed to speak without an attorney?" Lopez hesitated. "I believe he understood." But the doubt had been planted. Dr. Valerie Rao, the chief medical examiner, was the prosecution's most important witness. She testified about the autopsy in graphic, clinical detail. David suffered a linear skull fracture approximately 4 inches long, Dr. Rao explained. She showed diagrams and photographs. The fracture extended from the left parietal region to the occipital region. He also suffered subdural hematoma, subarachnoid hemorrhage, and contusions to the brain tissue itself. "In your expert opinion, what caused these injuries?" Mizrahi asked. "Blunt force trauma to the head. The injuries are consistent with the head striking a hard, flat surface, with significant force or with a hard object striking the head." "Could these injuries have been caused by a simple fall?" "No. The force required to cause this type of fracture is substantial. This was not a child falling from standing height. This was a high-velocity impact." "Could these injuries have been caused by the defendant pushing David into a bookshelf?" "Yes. If the child was pushed with sufficient force, and his head struck the corner of a hard object like a wooden bookshelf, these injuries are consistent with that mechanism." Dr. Rao also testified about the other injuries on David's body: the bruises, the signs of malnutrition, the evidence of chronic abuse. This child had been abused for a significant period before his death, Dr. Rao testified. The pattern of injuries suggests repeated trauma over weeks or months. On cross-examination, J. Plotkin tried to introduce doubt about who had inflicted the older injury. "Dr. Rao, you testified that David had bruises in various stages of healing. Some were fresh, Some were a week or two old. Some were even older. Correct? 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 Dot. Is there any way to determine who inflicted those older injuries? No. I can only say that they were inflicted. So they could have been inflicted by the defendant, or by the mother, or by the mother's boyfriend, or by anyone who had access to David. That's correct. And the cause of death, the fractured scullus, that consistent with a single impulsive push by a frustrated child. It's consistent with blunt force trauma. Whether it was impulsive is not a medical question. The prosecution's case was strong. The evidence was damning. But the defense was about to present a very different narrative. Defense's case. The defense's case focused on three main themes: Cristian's history of trauma, the systemic failures that led to the tragedy, and the question of intent. Dr. Michael Brannon returned to the stand to testify about Cristian's psychological state. But he explained, once again, how years of abuse had fundamentally altered Cristian's brain development. Cristian's prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and decision-making, is significantly underdeveloped, Dr. Brannon testified. When he's in a high-stress situation, his ability to control his actions is severely impaired. What happened on March 3rd was not a calculated, intentional act. It was a trauma response. Dr. Brannon also testified about Cristian's intellectual limitations. With an IQ of 79, Cristian functions at a level below what we'd expect for his age. He has difficulty understanding cause and effect, difficulty planning ahead, difficulty understanding the long-term consequences of his actions. On cross-examination, Mizrahi challenged Dr. Brannon's conclusions. Dr. Brannon, you've testified that Cristian has difficulty understanding consequences. But after he pushed David, he made a decision not to tell anyone. Doesn't that suggest he understood that he had done something wrong? It suggests he was afraid, Dr. Brannon replied. Fear and understanding consequences are different things. Cristian was afraid of being punished, which is understandable given his history. But I don't believe he fully grasped that David was dying and that immediate medical attention could save his life. The defense also called Linda Martinez, the CPS social worker who had investigated the Galarraga family in 2009. Martinez testified about her visit to the home, her concerns about Cristian's safety, and her recommendation that he be removed from his mother's care. I believed then, and I believe now, that Cristian was in danger, Martinez testified, her voice breaking. I recommended removal, but my supervisor overruled me. She said we should try to keep the family together, provide services, give them another chance. If your recommendation had been followed, if Cristian had been removed from that home in 2009, do you believe we'd be here today? Plotkin asked. No, Martinez said, tears streaming down her face. I don't think David would be dead, and I don't think Cristian would be on trial. The defense called several other witnesses who testified about the failures of the system teachers who had reported concerns and were ignored, doctors who had documented injuries and seen no follow-up, neighbors who had called the child abuse hotline only to see nothing change. Each witness added to the narrative the defense was constructing. Cristian was not a killer. He was a victim of systemic failure, a child who had been failed at every turn. And then, the most anticipated moment of the trial arrived. Cristian Fernandez took the stand. Cristian's testimony. On November 14, 2011, Cristian Fernandez was sworn in to testify in his own defense. He was 13 years old now, but he still looked like a child. He wore a shirt and tie that were slightly too big for him. His hair was neatly combed. His hands were shaking. Jay Plotkin approached him gently. Cristian, I know this is scary, but I need you to answer some questions as honestly as you can. Okay? Cristian nodded. On March 3rd, when your mother asked you to watch David, how did you feel? Cristian's voice was barely audible. I didn't want to. David was always crying. I didn't know how to make him stop. What happened that morning? He wouldn't stop crying. I tried to help him, but nothing worked, and I got frustrated. What did you do? Cristian's eyes filled with tears. I pushed him, and he hit his head. Did you mean to hurt him? No, Bao Wang. Cristian was crying now, his thin shoulders shaking. I didn't mean to hurt him. I just wanted him to stop crying. Why didn't you call for help? I was scared. I thought I would get in trouble. If you could go back and change what happened, would you? Yes. Hey. Cristian's voice broke. I wish I had never pushed him. I wish I had called someone. I wish David was still alive. The courtroom was silent. Several jurors were wiping their eyes. On cross-examination, Mizrahi was measured but pointed. Cristian, you said you were scared you'd get in trouble. But you knew David was hurt, didn't you? I don't know. I thought he was sleeping. Did you see blood? Cristian hesitated. A little. But you didn't tell anyone? No. Don't. Why not? Cristian had no answer. Closing arguments, 200 words. The trial concluded with closing arguments. Mizrahi's closing was brief and powerful. Ladies and gentlemen, no one disputes that Cristian Fernandez has had a difficult life. But having a difficult life does not give you the right to take another person's life. David Galarraga was 2 years old. He trusted his brother. And his brother killed him. That is the truth. And now, you must hold him accountable. Plotkin's closing was emotional and impassioned. Cristian Fernandez is not a murderer. He is a traumatized child who was pushed beyond his breaking point. The adults who were supposed to protect him failed. The system that was supposed to keep him safe failed. And now, you have the power to decide his future. Don't compound the failures. Don't send a child to prison for life. Find him not guilty of murder. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. Verdict, sentencing, and epilogue. Verdict. On November 21, 2011, at 4:37 p.m., the jury returned with a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreman stood. In the case of the state of Florida v. Cristian Fernandez on the charge of first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant not guilty. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Cristian's attorneys grabbed each other's hands. Cristian himself looked stunned, not quite comprehending what had just happened. But the foreman wasn't finished. On the lesser-included charge of aggravated manslaughter of a child, we the jury find the defendant guilty. The verdict was a compromise. The jury had concluded that Cristian had not intended to kill David, that this was not premeditated murder. But they also concluded that he was responsible for David's death through his reckless actions. Under Florida law, aggravated manslaughter of a child carried a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison. But because Cristian was a juvenile, the judge would have discretion in sentencing. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 months later. Sentencing. On January 10, 2012, Judge Cooper held the sentencing hearing. She had reviewed hundreds of pages of document psychological evaluations, sentencing memoranda from both sides, letters from advocates and victims' rights groups. Before announcing the sentence, she allowed victim impact statements. A representative from David's extended family spoke about the loss of a bright, innocent child. Then Judge Cooper spoke. This court recognizes that Cristian Fernandez has been failed by every system designed to protect him. But this court also recognizes that David Galarraga lost his life. There must be accountability. She sentenced Cristian to 8 years in a juvenile facility, followed by 1 year of supervised probation. It was far less than the maximum, but still an enormous portion of Cristian's young life. He would be 20 years old when released. Cristian Fernandez was released from custody in January 2018 at age 19. He had spent his teenage years in a juvenile detention facility, receiving therapy, education, and treatment. He now lives under a new name in an undisclosed location. Those who have worked with him describe a young man, still struggling with the trauma of his past, but trying to build a life. Bianca Galarraga pleaded guilty to aggravated manslaughter and was sentenced to 15 years. She was released in 2025. Cristian's case contributed to the 2012 Supreme Court ruling in Miller v. Alabama, which found mandatory life without parole for juveniles unconstitutional. David's death was a tragedy, but so was Cristian's childhood, and the question remains, how do we, as a society, balance justice with compassion? How do we hold children accountable while acknowledging the circumstances that shaped them? There are no easy answers.